Hello, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network. This show is being aired via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald. My name is Himani Gupta Carlson, and I am a professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs, New York, as well as a community-based farmer and writer. I want to open our show tonight first by offering respect to the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, who were the original caretakers of much of upstate New York, where the Asian American Herald is based. And in offering this respect, I also acknowledge myself as a settler, and I thank the Haudenosaunee for providing me with shelter. Our guest tonight is Kesha Ram. She is a veteran political leader who was just elected to the Vermont State Senate. Senator Ram served in Vermont State House of Representatives from 2009 to 2016. She then ran in 2016 for Lieutenant Governor of Vermont before making her bid for the state Senate this year. And her victory makes her the first woman of color to serve in Vermont State Senate. So Senator Ram, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me and for your acknowledgement. I'll add the Abenaki people of Vermont.
Really yes. And I worked actually with the Brujak family a bit. I'm on their board of directors in Dakina. And so I was very pleased to see that you had pushed for federal recognition of the Abenaki people.
Thank you. It was an honor and pleasure to be able to do that work.
Yeah, awesome. So, excuse me. You've had quite a strong political career, and you're actually still pretty young. So I anticipate that there's going to be much more out on the horizon ahead. And so I actually was wondering if you could just begin by telling us what draws you to politics and most particularly to political office.
Absolutely. You know, I actually think it'll probably come up in some discussion about my great-great-grandfather, Sir Ganga Ram. But I don't think I realized how much that kind of civic leadership was in my blood until I learned more about his story. And at the same time, you know, I have a father who immigrated from India, the part of India that became Pakistan. I have a mother who came from Chicago, and her family came from Ireland, England, and Russia, persecuted as Jews until they got to the United States. And so global upheaval and the way that, you know, political and cultural factors influence where someone can live, what rights they have, what access to opportunity they have, has had a big influence on my story. My Jewish mother and my Indian father ended up running an Irish pub in Los Angeles, which is probably where I got some of my skills standing up for myself and, you know, speaking truth to power.
That's awesome. Wow. So an Irish pub run by a Jewish woman and an Indian man sounds really fascinating. I wonder if you can actually take us back into your family ancestry and tell us about your great-great-grandfather as well as your aunt. And how much, you know, and go ahead and start with that. And then I've got a follow-up question.
Yeah, I mean, so first I would start by saying, you know, I loved my Dadiji, my grandmother who came from India to live with us the day before I was born. She taught me how to read and write in cursive. You know, when I was a small child, she was always pushing me to do better and more, like a good Indian grandmother. And when I got into politics and I called her, I said, you know, Dadiji, I'm the youngest state legislator in Vermont and even the country. You know, that was in 2008, 2009. She said, you know, you were always such a good singer. I wish you could go back to that. I mean, she was so worried about how corrupt I would become in politics that she'd rather I be kind of a starving musician instead. So, you know, for any Asian folks watching at home, I hope that resonates. It's not always easy to demonstrate that there is a somewhat virtuous path in politics. And at the same time, then I started to learn about all the people in my family who had contributed in that way and had been part of civic life. And I had always had the biography of Sir Ganga Ram growing up. But, you know, sorry about that. It was, you know, it's a biography that some folks may or may not know, a man of all seasons, that really kind of catalogs his engineering feats, but you know, doesn't necessarily talk about how much of a man of the people he was. And so I've had to collect all of those stories over time and how much he cared about women's empowerment, girls' empowerment, homes for widows, how much he fought for access to healthcare and medicine. He's quite ahead of his time. And so while it doesn't surprise me that there are people who, still remember his legacy, the fondness people have for him has been overwhelming. I mean, just in such a positive way. It's amazing to know that people from all walks of life and all different backgrounds and career paths see him as such an important part of their story as well. It was only when I went in 2015 to Delhi on the way to Hardwar to take my Dadiji's ashes to the Holy River that her sister, my great aunt, said, there's another politician in the family and she's in London and she's in the House of Lords. And I thought, no one's ever told me, when you've come from a family that's been ripped apart by partition and has that history of upheaval, people scatter to the wind and not everybody stays in touch. And, of course, that kind of stress built some tension within the family. So not everybody wanted to stay connected. So I actually wrote Baroness Srila Flather a letter, and I said, I'm your long lost, first cousin, whatever you call it, once removed. I'm your next generation cousin. You're my father's cousin, and I would love to come meet you. And she, lo and behold, she wrote back, and she offered for me to come visit. And we're in different political parties. She was conservative and now is non-aligned. She was appointed by Margaret Thatcher. It's an amazing story, being the first South Asian woman in UK politics. And when I went to visit her, I thought maybe we'll have nothing in common. And we went to go visit the Parliament building, and she knew every security guard's name, every cafeteria worker's name, every custodian's name. And I thought, we are totally related. We just love being around people and hearing their stories. And so we've had a great friendship since then. She's finally stopped participating in the Lords in person, which she did, to a very, very ripe age, very mature age, but she's finally slowing down.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And there's something about the virtue of politics that surfaces in that story, knowing the names of everyone. I mean, I feel like that there's something very special about that, being able to just have that ability, have that sensibility, first of all, that's something that's important and of value. And then to be able to actually carry it out really speaks to a generous heart and a generous soul, regardless of political affiliation.
Exactly. And especially for her to say, I don't know who this person is I'm welcoming into my house, and what a story folks may not know is that her, part of the reason she ended up in the UK in our family is because her father was a viceroy in the British Army and served in World War II with great distinction. And she was on the tube one day in London, and some older gentleman said, you're in my way. Your people never fought for anything, and just sort of made a terrible comment to her. And she wanted this man to know, our Indians fought and died in World War II in very high numbers, and many Commonwealth countries contributed more than their fair share to, a war that wouldn't ultimately benefit them in the same way. And so she worked to build a monument to all the Commonwealth soldiers who never got credit for their role in World War II in front of Buckingham Palace. And that's all I had is that article about her before I went to see her. And I thought, this woman sounds amazing. We could disagree on everything else, but she wants to uplift and tell the stories of others, and we have to be related.
Yeah. You've got hope you're planning to write a book someday, or have somebody write a book about your family, because you've definitely got a very interesting legacy. Just for our viewers, I want to just kind of throw in a few dates and details so that you have some idea of the impact of Senator Ram's ancestry. Mm-hmm. Sir Ganga Ram was knighted in the late 1860s. Is that correct? The late 1800s.
Late 1800s, I would say. I don't want to get too specific. There's probably some historians out there who know than I do, and really, know his legacy enough to love him more than I know enough to love. But yes, late 1800s.
Yeah, so late 1800s. And so the work that he was doing, that very progressive work that he was doing in what was British India at the time, and is, Lahore is now part of Pakistan, current day Pakistan, but the hospital that he is named after, that bears his name, is in Delhi. That work was being done kind of right in the midst of really, really stern clampdowns by British authority on through imperialism, following kind of this mutiny or war of independence, depending on which side of the story you're talking about. So that was when he was really advocating for women and for the unheard, which is quite significant. And then Margaret Thatcher, of course, was Prime Minister of Britain in the 1970s and 1980s. So that speaks to kind of the long legacy of Baroness Shira Flather.
And before she was appointed to the House of Lords, she was mayor of Windsor. She was probably one of the first Asian mayors in Europe, you know, and that's where Windsor Castle is. Not to mention, I am sure she's still one of the only Asian American women to be a mayor in Europe. So it was quite a story. I really, just admire her so much.
Yeah, wow, that is amazing. I'm wondering about partition. It was her generation that got affected by partition. Can you talk a little bit about what you know of that from your family's experience?
Yeah, it is very limited. In fact, having her as an aunt has helped fill in some of the gaps for me, because my father, I only have one blood buaji. I have one aunt, that is a little older than him, but they were both small children when they had to flee the part of India that became Pakistan in the partition. So my father was only 2, I believe. And Baroness Flather is a little bit older in that generation. She was on the older side of that generation. So she, had a little bit more a knowledge of what was going on, et cetera. My family, I think a lot about having Jews in one side of my family who were being persecuted because of their religion, who left really early. They thought, we're out of here, turn of the century, did not wait around for, the rise of the Reich or anything like that. Just thought, we got to go. And, they probably had something to do with not having very much to leave behind. And yet, because of Sir Ganga Ram and because of the wealth and the factories and the stories and history that had accumulated in Lahore, it was very hard for my family to leave. They really stayed until, as they would say, they left only with the clothes on their backs, and had a challenge rebuilding. I don't cast any judgment, because in the US it's complicated too. Your family that wasn't so intimately affected might try to set you up with a new factory or some kind of new position. But it's a lot of pride that you have. You've lost everything, and what are you going to do next? They settled in Hoshiarpur. So they stayed in Punjab. But in the 50s, they worked with our relatives in Delhi to bring the name Sir Ganga Ram to the hospital in Delhi that now bears its name. And I always thought from them, I think the sad part is a lot of times they didn't want to talk about Lahore at all. They didn't, and so I got the impression everything was wiped away, and yet then I learned they kept the name Sir Ganga Ram on the hospital in Lahore. They have the statue up to him. They deeply respect and honor him. I wouldn't have known all of that just from the way my family tells the story, because they're so personally affected. It's very hard for them to see past that and really know that he's still celebrated and our family still has a place there. We've gone as far as the Wagah border for the lowering of the colors, but we never have crossed over. And I always thought the danger would be someone, an extreme group in Pakistan might say she's a target because of who her great-great-grandfather is. I think more so, you have Prime Minister Modi fomenting a lot of anti-Islam rhetoric, and so I worry about what it would mean to go over, but I also think it's a good time to go over and show that Hindus and Muslims have gotten along for thousands of years before Modi, and I would probably be treated quite well if I visited.
Yeah, I went to Lahore actually in 1996, so it was quite a while ago. But it was interesting to cross the border, and Lahore was very hospitable and very welcoming. But I was hesitant to say I was a Hindu. So if anyone asked, I said I was a Christian.
So interesting. I don't think if they tell people who I am, if I'm sort of out in that way, I don't think I could hide who I am. I don't think people would want me to, but it is, we both on both sides of this conflict have lived through a lot. And so, I'd want to treat it very delicately.
Yeah. I think there's still a lot of healing to be done, but hopefully in time, maybe in our lifetimes, we'll see a good reconciliation. So, as I was preparing for tonight's interview, I actually came across an interesting remark. It was actually from a story that you had posted to your Facebook page. And in the story, it referred to Vermont as being the whitest state in the US. And so I was actually wondering, from your perspective as someone who lives in Vermont, to what extent is that true? And what kind of challenges does that present then for people who are not white, who are, Asian American or other people of color?
Yeah, I mean, so it's as true as I, as I know. And it's, I'm not sure if I'm, wait, okay, there we go.
No, I clicked you out of the stream. I'm so sorry.
No problem. I just didn't know if anyone could hear me at that point. But, so is Vermont the whitest state in the country? Pretty much. We're often competing for that title, which we shouldn't want to have, with Maine. But I think Maine has a lot of indigenous people that don't get counted in terms of, their sort of count of people of color in the state, because they do have federally recognized tribes and federal tribal land. But we, so we're first or second whitest state in the country usually. And, what that means, I think, when we were kids in Los Angeles, any Indian person my father saw, we had to stop and have a conversation. Where village is your family from? Oh, we want to make some connection to, that's a similar village to where my cousin's uncle, so growing up, we thought it was just so frustrating to, keep having to hear him try to recount all these tales of India. And I'm much more sympathetic now that I'm older to him trying to sort of hold on to the world that he knew. And at the same time, Vermont's the kind of place where if you do see an Indian person you don't know or any brown person, you're sort of stopping and saying, who are you? How long have you been here? Can we be friends? Should we have dinner? It started to change here, but, there are probably still only 300 Indian families, Indian identifying families. At the same time, we're a refugee resettlement site, and we try to take more per capita of our refugee neighbors, then, we usually take double our sort of allotment for the state in normal non-Trump years. And so, we are now home to thousands of Bhutanese, Nepali community members. And, I have great affection for all of them. Many are close friends. They cook for me, which is really nice because otherwise it's very hard to get good Indian or South Asian food here for the most part. And then when I was running, for bigger office, I started to realize that still in Vermont, literally from the 70s onward, most of the franchise hotels are owned by Indians here. So I had never met them before. And all of a sudden I'm traveling the whole state and I can find an Indian in every town at the Days Inn or the Comfort Inn or wherever. And I thought, we're everywhere. We are everywhere. So people kept saying, I can't believe we have a legislator in Vermont. And I'm like, we are everywhere. And we're pushed to, do better and more all the time. So
what attracted you to Vermont? I know you went to Vermont, mainly University of Vermont for college, but why there after growing up in California and particularly LA?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably my mother's influence the most. She always talked about rolling hills and covered bridges and leaves changing color and seasons. It made LA sound a little bit sad and dreary. Everyone just thought you would never leave Southern California. I'm thinking, why wouldn't you leave? Fewer people ask me now why I ever left California, given the fires and the floods and the pandemic experience. I think Vermont just does community right. My mother only told me after I accepted at UVM that she romanticized that because she always had this dream of living in Vermont. I had never known that before I moved here. And then I've had relatives since, come to visit who are Indian, who say, oh, this reminds us of Punjab and Kashmir. Like, this reminds us of the mountains over there, which I have not visited. And so, somehow I think my heart found this place and is happy here.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. I'm about 15 minutes from the Vermont border, actually, where I live. So I'm not, I was very excited when I moved out here because I came here from the West Coast as well. I came from Seattle, and I just felt very attached to the community, the community feeling right here, right away.
Exactly. I always say, I'll always have a piece of my sense of place in California, the beach and the sunset over the Pacific Ocean and things like that. But my sense of community is now very squarely settled here. People care if you get in a car accident, if they don't know you. They bring you chicken soup if you say you're sick on social media. I just love that people see me in my humanity and care. And, in the context of being in the whitest state in the country, it's had its challenges because there's just this attitude here that you may face in upstate New York as well, that you'll just kind of never be from here. Doesn't matter. I'm engaged to a, local boy, grew up on a dairy farm, 8th generation, but I'll never be a Vermonter myself, so it's just, that's fine. But it's that kind of attitude that gets put more on brown people. You could have grown up in our area and be South Asian or, be Black, but people will always think of you as from away because it's such an overwhelmingly white state.
Yeah, that's so interesting because you can't be a Vermonter, but you can be a representative, a political representative in Vermont. You can represent the people in the state house and, the state Senate. So how does that kind of change the ball game and call attention maybe to some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, because the perception people have of us as such a white state and there's nobody there, it needs to change. It needs to change so that we have a future that's relevant. We are in demographic decline, as many parts of northern New England and upstate New York are. And the future workforce, the future generations are going to be far more diverse. So right now, about 90% of our population growth in Vermont in the last 10 years has been from people of color. 90%, because white folks are not having kids. They're retiring in Florida and they're, just sort of staying stagnant, really. And the only people who are moving here and, from refugee resettlement or for higher ed or for, some of our industry here are mostly people of color. And so, we have a quickly shifting demographic at the same time that we really need to become more welcoming so people want to stay here. And that, I just wrote a recent op-ed that was very widely circulated in the state saying Vermont doesn't have a recruitment problem because we like to think we'll just put out more marketing materials, we'll get more young people to come here. Its problem is retention. Its problem is that a diverse cohort of young people come and they feel stepped on and marginalized and told you'll never be one of us. And you can only hear that so much. And you think, why am I here? I'm just going to go to Boston or California. Yeah. Somewhere and just blend in a little bit more. So we have that challenge to grapple with.
Yeah. Did you have that feeling when you moved to Vermont as a young person?
If I did, I just wasn't particularly self-aware that it was sort of a problem or, anything like that. I was very, well, this is what we do in California. And, this is so interesting to compare Vermont to other parts of the country. And then eventually people said, you really have interesting insights and you're very thoughtful and you are giving us new ways of thinking about who we are. So you should run for student body president. You should run for the legislature. So it really felt like just having a kind of confidence and fearlessness that probably came from the Irish pub and from growing up in, a high school of 5,000 kids in LA and just a big community. Wasn't afraid of anybody, and we also in politics, we have plenty of people who've come from Connecticut or Massachusetts or somewhere else. And it started to point out to people the kind of hypocrisy, but also, that they would kind of come to the door and they'd say, okay, so let me get this straight. You're from Hollywood and you've come to Vermont and you don't mind the winter. And now you want to be our legislator? You sound crazy enough to be a Vermonter. You have my vote, So it just was this kind of attitude of, go for it. Like, can't get any nuttier. So, that's kind of in Vermont, maybe not in other parts of New England, et cetera, but certainly in Vermont, it's a kind of place where people like to strike out in a new way. And I felt accepted into the gang of misfits here in Vermont.
Yeah, and I guess that is true. Vermont does have that gang of misfits reputation to it. So it's never struck me. I mean, it was actually the whitest state term sort of took me by surprise a little because I've never thought of Vermont as being a conservative place. I've always thought of it as being a very, out there, ultimate environment, organic farmer dream sort of place.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have Bernie Sanders, you have Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's has been on a campaign to talk about white supremacy and police brutality. So we talk a big game here in Vermont, but at the same time, it's easy to do that when you haven't been confronted with how you react to your implicit biases and your snap judgments and the things that are ingrained in us. So, most people of color and Black folks, particularly who've grown up in Vermont, maybe they felt a lot of acceptance, but there was a small minority of folks who used the N-word toward them, who, made them feel really alone and isolated. And I also think, too, what happened in New England to some folks that didn't happen to me in California, I got to go from group to group and, see what it was like to participate in different things as a kind of ambiguously brown person. For many, kids of color who've grown up in New England, they worked really hard to fit in and be very white, and to see that is the best thing you can be from a young age. And that just wasn't my experience in California. Yeah. There was no ingrained supremacy in being white in any way. We had very strong Latinx and Black culture at school. We had people who were very proud of their international heritage, very proud of who they were. And on top of all that, I went to high school with Stephen Miller, who's like xenophobe #1 in the White House. But we didn't grow up with a sense that anyone was lesser than, particularly because of their race. And in New England, you could almost feel how people had spent a lot of time trying to figure out how they would react to whiteness in their lives. And we just grew up without that barrier.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think the New England experience was very much like my Midwest experience. It definitely resonates. It's difficult. It's sad. I'd like to kind of shift over to some broader issues. We've actually hosted quite a few South Asian American political candidates on this show over the past few months. And I believe actually all of them have been women. And so they were running for a variety of things, mayor, city councils, town boards, state assemblies. And a lot of them weren't successful, but I was actually impressed that so many of them were women and that so many of them were South Asian, second generation American-born women. And I just was curious, from your perspective, what does this say about Asian American political participation in the current moment and also going forward?
I mean, number one, more women should be able to, hold power and show different ways of leadership in India, So I just was back there right before the pandemic. And, still feeling that sense that while there were women in politics, they were supposed to be and act a certain way, and it's funny, I can't remember the name of the woman. She was an MP from Maharashtra, and she was the most eloquent, of anyone speaking that day. And it was a lot about kind of censorship of the minority parties. So, I don't ever, and my father never let me believe that the U.S. was better in its treatment of women in politics. Certainly we've had more leadership in other countries than we have seen women in the U.S. We have such an amazing sea change with Kamala Harris in the White House. But, it's still, what I think we're grappling with here in the U.S. that's different is that people need to see women disagree with each other. They need to see women of color disagree with each other. They need to see that we're not a monolithic community in the way that we act and think. And, and I also think it's really important for us to see each other fail and get back up and try again. I ran for statewide office in 2016. I was 29 years old. I don't know that I thought about it as, like being South Asian pushed me further in that or in any regard, but it just, it helped me see that, I don't know if it's also just the feeling that you're kind of trying to prove to your grandmother, that there's value in what you're doing. But I also think when you look around at Indian culture, the history of chaining, Indian women chaining themselves to trees in order to save them, the history of women fighting for water rights, fighting for the basic necessities for their kids, with Gandhi and my great-great-grandfather's story of, different ways of trying to gain independence and give people hope and give people a sense of their own dignity and worth. You have many stories in our long history with democracy and with struggling as civil society to draw from. And so, we have this rich cadre of experiences to share with others about what it means to get involved. But I think it's really important for young women and young South Asian folks, and particularly young South Asian women, to see that you won't die if you run for office and you lose. You will gain a lot of friends and new experiences, and you can get back up and try again.
Yeah, awesome. Well, what about old South Asian women like me?
That too, absolutely. And I would not call you old. You should definitely run for office. And yeah,
maybe after my my professor career and my farming career are over. But.
Well, and to be fair to you in New York, the New York Assembly is more of a full-time job. I'm sure you have some local offices that are more part-time, but here in Vermont, like in many other states, like New Hampshire, I was just talking to Lata Mangipuri, who, I don't know if you've had her on your show, but she's a South Asian woman in New Hampshire, makes great South Indian food that I get to enjoy when I see her. And, she represents Nashua. They make $100 a year. They, have a real time of it, but we're citizens legislatures. So, you can have another job, you can have your other career path. But, I think everyone should think of it as service that you do at some point in your life. You could be on the school board, on the select board, on a commission for the library or the parks, but it's all good practice for seeing that what government is just aggregating people's concerns and problems and doing your best to come up with imperfect solutions that slightly disappoint everybody, but really move the ball down the court.
Yeah. That's such an interesting way of putting that. I'll have to remember that for sure. So, final question. What was going through your mind during the inaugural ceremonies? Seeing Kamala Harris sworn into office and hearing Amanda Gorman's poem, among other things. There were a lot of other.
No, those were the highlights for sure. Yes. So, with the inauguration of Vice President Kamala Harris, I think before and after, what my frontal lobe was telling me was, this is long overdue, and this is amazing, and this is, we're finally here. And during the actual swearing in, watching that, something just broke open inside of me, and I just like so many other versions of myself, so many, Keshas who felt like a child, who, didn't think that they belonged, who didn't think that they would win the student government race, who doubted, they all just got a big hug, they just felt released. And I think that happened for a lot of women of color, particularly in the country. It's an incredible moment. And then, I mean, you know, I was just sad that Vice President Harris, I realized, oh yeah, she doesn't really get an opportunity to make a speech. She's just the vice president, you know, and President Biden did an amazing job. But of course, Amanda Gorman really, really took us to the mountaintop, and every word of every line felt like it was, you know, washing us clean in this pandemic and reminding us of our humanity and reminding us what we had been through. And, you know, it was such a gift. And I commented after, you know, people, oh, she's so young and that's amazing. You know, give young people a chance. They're, you know, they're not the future, they're the present, and they have something to say right now, you know, so give them a place at every major event, give them a platform and a microphone.
That is so, you know, that is so true, because we do think of young people as the future, but no, they're here, they're present, and they are smarter than any generation before. So we are out of time. I just want to thank you, Senator Kesha Ram, for joining us tonight. And I want to thank everyone out there for also joining us for our weekly Asian American Herald show. Once again, I'm Hamani Gupta Carlson, and I have been speaking with Vermont State Senator Kesha Ram. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in the capital region of New York and well beyond. So please continue to send us story ideas and look for the recording of this show on our Facebook page. Have a good evening and see you all again next Thursday. Thank you so much.